Our headliner artist, Jamie Bates Slone, is here in the flesh. First, I'd like to thank Lee Gruber and the Clay Festival for making this event happen every year. So thank you so very much. We're so grateful. And I'd also like to thank Western New Mexico University and Dr. Shepard and Dr. Crocker, who are not here, but let's give them a round of applause anyway. The collaboration between the Clay Festival and the university has been going on long before I've been here. And I'm just so grateful to be in this place that has this incredible festival that happens every summer. So let's introduce our artist for the evening, Jamie Bates Slone. She's the assistant professor of ceramics at the University of Oklahoma. She got her Master in Fine Arts at the University of Kansas and her Bachelor in Fine Arts at Central Missouri University. She's been a resident at many prestigious studios, including the Archie Bray Foundation, the Aramont Center for Arts and Crafts, just to name a couple. She's led workshops, lectures, and been published in many prestigious periodicals. And we're just so incredibly lucky to have her here. She just had her first day of her 5-day workshop today, and the work that came out of that workshop is just amazing. So please join me in learning more about Jamie Bates Slone and welcoming her here.
Can you hear me all right, or is it, okay, it's on? Okay, sorry about that. All right, hi everybody. My name is Jamie Bates Slone. I'd like to first of all thank Courtney and Lee and Alexis and everybody with the Clay Festival that's been so incredibly helpful and helping me, oh, and Karen especially too, getting my exhibition set up and getting this workshop set up. It's been a delight to be here, slowly falling in love with Silver City. It's quite a magical place, so I'm really excited to be here. So a little bit about me, like Courtney said, I got my master's at the University of Kansas and my undergraduate degree at the University of Central Missouri. I'm originally from a little town about an hour north of Kansas City, Missouri. So I grew up in a really rural farming community with very little exposure to art. So my journey to getting to where I am now was very clumsy and a little unplanned, but I'm happy to be here and ecstatic to be making work for the rest of my life, hopefully. And yeah, so I'm going to share a little bit of the work that I've done in the last 10 years. So basically rounding out my thesis exhibition and kind of showing you the journey from then to now. So this is an image from my thesis exhibition titled The Science of Sentiment. This was an exhibition that was really reflective upon my life at the time. My uncle, who was basically like my grandfather, had just passed away from lung cancer. And this kind of created like this strange obsession about like my own health and my own morbidity. And I also started thinking more or less about like my own family's history with cancer and illness and things like that. So I started becoming kind of like a little bit neurotic about these sort of things. This particular exhibition was kind of, again, like a reflection on those ideas. I had these 3 tables set up in this space. There were these large white tables with these objects I called specimen on them. These tables were kind of representing the past, the present, and the future of my family and my experience. So on those tables, I had these small glaze casted objects. These are entirely made of glaze. I'll explain the process a little bit more once we get a little bit further into the slideshow. But these specific pieces, I would create these small heads out of clay and then take molds of them and then cast them with this glaze, and then we'd morph and change over time. So it was kind of reflective of like how the body changes over time and adapts over time. And it also was reflective of how disease and changes and morphs and spreads throughout the body. I incorporated these small magnifying glasses so people can make the connections between these objects and life-size scaled figure in the corner of the room. So this figure was my first life-size figure I ever made. When I was in grad school, I was discouraged a lot from working with the figure because it was too literal. But it was something that I was really, really drawn to doing. Since I was a young child, I wanted to sculpt the figure. I wanted to draw the figure. I talked earlier in my workshop about how my parents' fun party trick was to like have their friends point to a part of their body, and then I would like name the bone. I don't remember many of those bones anymore, but like when I was a kid, I was just like, yeah, this is fun, right? I wanted to be a doctor, and I was just obsessed with portraiture. Like, long story short, we had like a little mini society in 3rd grade, and I made all the money. I made the flag, and I did portraits of 3rd graders to make my money. Luckily, 3rd graders are narcissistic and love to be drawn, even poorly by another 3rd grader. I made a lot of money. Fake money. So yeah, so that's kind of like where this all came from, and that drive to like create the figure came from. So I'm glad that at this point I finally decided like I'm gonna stick to my guns and do what I really like am driven to do. So again, like I said, this is the first life-sized figure I'd ever done, and there were a lot of kinks that I needed to work out with it. Like I can see the things now, like the shoulders were really broad, the feet were large, the ears were large, and these were all things that I was projecting onto myself. And we've talked about this in my workshop just this morning too, about how we have to kind of unsee what we think about ourselves and look at ourselves objectively when we're sculpting ourselves. All right, moving on. So shortly after I finished my MFA at the University of Kansas, I started a position at Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri. It wasn't the greatest place on earth, so we quickly moved back to Kansas City, and I became a resident at Red Star Studios at Belger Crane Yard Studios in 2013. At that time, my primary focus was to kind of explore that glaze casting process a little bit more. That's what you saw with those small heads before. This process was something I developed while in grad school. It was kind of like a happy accident. What happened was I put this particular glaze that I cast with on a piece, and it ran all over the place and like flowed all over the kiln, but it landed in sand, because at least I'm smart enough to like be prepared for the disaster, right? But when that happened, like the glaze kind of created a bit of like a cookie. It like stopped the sand and it like created a form. And I was like, I don't know how my brain got from point A to point B, but I was like, I think I can make this work to where I can make a thing strictly out of glaze. So I started making these objects I call phenotypes. These are actually casts of my own hand. I'll show you the process here in a sec, but that I basically cast my hand in plaster bandage and then wiggle it out and then fill that with glaze and cast it in that way. The reason why I chose the name phenotype was that by definition, like a phenotype is all of the observable traits of an organism that result from the interaction of its total genetic inheritance and its environment. So I was thinking about like what was passed down from one generation to the next genetically, whether that be trauma or whether that be actual genetic disease. And then also thinking about what I was informed by my environment. So that was maybe where I grew up and things like that. I also grew up in a small town where there were a lot of like farming malpractices whenever I was in the 80s. So there was like chromium-6 that was used to fertilize the land and all sorts of things. So there was a lot of like, contention around that too. So I was very concerned about like my future and health. So there's a close-up version of these phenotypes. So you can kind of see it in this image here, but like these pick up so much detail, like the plaster bandage picks up the detail, like the fingerprints in my fingers, that sort of thing. And that translates into the glaze as well. So because this is a clay festival, I have a lot of process stuff in here. So bear with me if you're not interested in it. So that process actually starts again, like with my hand being casted in plaster bandage. Again, it's just me sitting there wrapping my own hand. I buy it from a veterinary supply. And then I fill that plaster bandage mold with a little bit of glaze, kind of like if you were slip casting or metal casting. So these are all kind of things I've drawn from my experiences with metal casting in undergrad and grad school, and then as well as slip casting in other courses. And then I fill, I then fill this crucible here with sand so it holds that form. Otherwise, that plaster bandage, whenever it burns away, it would just fall away. It would, any chemical water that exists in it no longer bonds the material, and so it will just fall away and crumble. So I had to create something that would support it during the firing. So there are the pieces while they're right before they're being fired. And then we have the photos of how I start to just kind of pick the plaster away, and kind of dissolves away actually from the pieces as well. So it's kind of like excavating these little objects, and I never really know how they're going to turn out. But I only use 2 glazes with this whole process as well. And I just change the colorants. And so that gives me like pretty much an endless supply of surface. So shortly after I was working with those phenotypes, and I was still working with the figure at the same time, trying to find ways to bridge the gap between my exploration and making Glaze do weird things and sculpting the figure. So this was kind of a part or a time whenever I kind of bridged those things together. So I was creating these objects that had kind of pockets in them and filling them with a foaming glaze that I would kick up a few notches with some sodium carbide, and it would basically just foam inside the kiln and kind of ooze out of these pockets. You'll see some more examples here in a second. And this like here, again, trying to kind of bridge those 2 bodies of work a little bit. I created this diptych that was kind of a reflection on how I was feeling at the time about kind of having something that's kind of like obviously within you, and how like maybe that thing that's within you can kind of take you over. And now that I look at this piece, and now that the movie Stranger Things has come out, I'm like, this is totally the upside down. But this is one of those pieces that like I really want to go back and readdress at some point, because there were a lot of challenges that I came across with this piece, and I feel like I could always come back to it. So, and I do that a lot in my work as well. I always come back to something eventually. And this was kind of like the pinnacle of that oozing glaze phase. Like it's completely and totally supported by the glaze and her one little toe. And this piece was about 40 inches long. So after I finished that piece, again, I started getting really inspired by medical imagery again. This time kind of basing it off of scans and electron micrographs of the body, and kind of paying attention to how they colorize these things. Like they don't naturally look like this whenever those images come up, but they go in on Photoshop and colorize all these things to kind of show you what's the matter, right? So from that came this body of work. When I was working at Red Star Studios in Kansas City, I was around a lot of potters. And so everybody's working quickly, right? And they're working in series. And it rubbed off on me. And so everything that I made, like every body of work I made at least 5 or 6 of them, right? I had an idea, and there's many iterations of what that idea was going to look like. And what usually happens is like 3 of those make it out in the world, or 3 of those make it out into the slideshow that I'm proud of. These particular pieces were more or less reflective upon like the types of cancers that have conflicted my family. So mutate addresses my grandfather, who just passed away like maybe a year prior to that, with liver cancer. Swell was a representation of ovarian cancer, and separate is a representation of lymphoma. And again, I'm still using those foaming glazes, but you'll see I'm using them in a much more subdued way with these objects. I was using a slip trailer and just kind of letting them sit on the surface rather than kind of ooze out of the surface of the figures. So continuing with that really like kind of hyper, almost like toxic looking surface, and playing with how color reacts to, how colors react to one another. I really loved playing with that with these particular pieces. I was using all Amoco underglazes and spraying everything. And I fire a little hotter. I fired a cone 2, and the colors are really rich at that temperature. And again, these pieces again are addressing those ideas about cancer, about illness, and specifically how cancer behaves when it starts to mutate, separate, and spread. And that is another piece that's part of that body of work. So when I finished my residency at Red Star Studios, I was teaching at 2 different universities, working at the art museum on campus, still working out of Red Star Studios, and a resident at another studio in Kansas City. And I was about to like lose it. It was like the ultimate like hard artist hustle. And so I kind of took a step back and was like, okay, well, what I really want to figure out and see if what I can do is if I can like, you know, just do the artist thing for a bit. So I moved to Helena, Montana, and started a residency at Studio 740 there. I was there for about 3 years, working alongside Beth Kavanagh and Alessandra Gallo, and many other residents that were there. And so that was a really scary and exciting time, but we made the big move. And I'm so glad that I did because I learned so much there. This was some of the work that I made when I first got there. Still, again, getting very literal with like the scans, maybe a little too literal this time, right? I was starting to feel like I was almost camouflaging the figure or losing all of that work that I did with these figures by creating such a busy surface. So I pulled back a little bit from that, and I'll show you what was created after this, but I'm going to show you some influences before that. So this was kind of like a big point of upheaval. Going to Studio 740 was not only like a big life change, but it was also like a huge change like mentally for me. I kind of experienced like a major depression for the first time in my life. I was diagnosed with anxiety and major depressive disorder while I was there. But I also started seeking help while I was there. So it was kind of like this moment of like finally coming to and realizing and coming to terms with this kind of monster I'd been grappling with my entire adult life. So as far as influences go at that time, I've always had a massive obsession with Bernini. It's not really about the subject matter for me. It's just really about the ability to capture flesh and the fold and the squish of it all, you know? So one of these days I will make it to Italy to see one of these in person, and I'll probably cry. But yeah, he's definitely one of those figurative sculptors that I just really, really dig. Anders Chrisar is another sculptor that I look to quite a bit. I really love the way he employs precision of form and creates like a really intensely personal psychological landscape with these figures. And it really like narrows it down to what you really want to see. I talk about that a lot in my workshops, like being very specific about what you want to see or you want the viewer to see. And I think that's what he's really accomplishing here. Christina West is another one of my influences as far as like scale goes. I really love the way that she plays with scale, interaction between the viewer and the work. Kiki Smith is another artist that like, you know, from the get-go, from like one of my first like art history courses, I really enjoy the way her work investigates mortality and the physicality of the human body, and the way she treats it with like honesty and vulnerability. That's really something that I strive to do. And then of course, Beth Kavanagh. Beth hasn't only just been an inspiration as far as work goes. I mean, she's taught me, well, probably about 100% of everything I know about building solid. And she just kind of taught me a lot about how to be a professional artist as well. Like I said, when I was at Studio 740, I was the only resident for a while. So I got a lot of special treatment, a lot of attention, and I really liked it. But yeah, so like I said, Beth was like my older sister. I mean, she held my hand at my first therapy session. Like she did a lot for me while I was there. And then Tip Tolan, Obviously another person who uses herself as reference a lot of the time to convey very complex ideas. Okay, so here is the first thing I built solid ever, which was stupid. But you know, I love to bite off a lot more than I can chew, and you know, force it down. So after about 6 months while I was at Studio 740, Beth convinced me to build something solid because I was struggling a lot. I was coil building everything before I built solid, and the process was dictating the work. Like I had much bigger ideas about what I wanted to do with the figure, but I couldn't accomplish them with coil building. Maybe someone else could, but I personally couldn't get it done. So, and also I was like working in the same studio as Beth Kavanagh. It would have been really stupid for me not to learn the ways, right? She's, I mean, arguably the best person for this. So again, this was my first piece I built solid. You can see like behind, I've got a couple posters that are behind it. Those are actually to scale. Like I've told a lot of the students in the workshop, I really try to set myself up for success. And so it's a lot of pre-planning that goes into things. Like I printed out that poster, mapped out where all of my armatures were going to go, and really just made sure I was like measuring from the poster and everything. So you can see like how that process is going here. And you can see all those armatures that are holding the piece up as I'm building it solid. So at this point, like this is actually how far I got on the piece before I actually started cutting it apart and hollowing it and refining it. So I always begin with extremities and work my way into like the torso of the body. You're gonna see this cat in a few photos. That was our studio cat at 740. She was a sweetheart. But I really love the fact that like I'm kind of working from the toes in, right? So I'm like really refining everything, sculpting those toes as I'm going, and really starting to like work my way in. So here's a little bit of that hollowing process, and you can see Piper making an appearance again inside my piece this time. She loved to get in there and try to attack my tools while I was hollowing. So you can see like that torso now that it's all hollowed out. And you can see that I'm building on top of what I call packing peanut pillows. And those really help to kind of cradle the work and keep it from flattening out. Foam works great, but these are, I think, much better because it really cradles and conforms to the piece. And then you'll see it here. I'm putting things back together before firing and creating a shrink slab. A shrink slab is basically a sheet of clay that's going to shrink with my work, so it allows it to shrink without cracking or catching on any kiln shelves or anything like that. It also allows me to fire the work as it is intended to be displayed. So this piece was in 7 different pieces before I fired it. She also had 2 different heads at one point, and I just kind of figured out which one I liked best and went with that one. But the piece is supported so that that body doesn't lose any kind of like any bit of its contortion or gesture or anything during its firing. And then you'll see on the right, that's the piece after it's been put back together. So I use PC11 epoxies, sculptural epoxies and such to put things back together. And a little bit of like what I call like, maybe redneck's not the best way to call it, but redneck engineering. Like, so you'll see like on that knee that there's glue holding it together, but I drilled holes into the sides of the leg so I could use wire to pin it in place. And that way it was able to support itself while the glue was curing. And then you just fill those holes in with glue and then you're good to go. So, oh, this is a little out of order. So this is before I started adding those parts, but you can see like, it just takes a lot of glue and patience and a lot of time. I had about a month to make this piece and it was like a month of purely dedicated studio time. And that really messed up my, my understanding of what I am capable of doing in a certain amount of time. Because from now on, I'm like, I did that in a month. I can do anything in like no time. But that again was like strictly dedicated almost every day. So here she is getting painted, again, using house paints. to paint everything. I love like when Beth told me her kind of comeback for using house paints on ceramic materials, which isn't as much of a poo-poo now as it used to be. But her reasoning and logic behind it, I think, is wonderful because ceramic, or not ceramic, but house paint is made up of like 95% ceramic material. And the only real things that aren't ceramic material is the binder. So, I mean, you can fire this and I mean, I've seen primer fired to cone 10 and it's beautiful. So here's that piece when it's been finished. So, again, this is whenever the conceptual basis of my work began to shift and it became a little bit more biographical. So I was thinking more about like my time dealing with anxiety and depression and kind of how I was deep in it at that time. And I started finding my work to be more of an emotional outlet. I mean, I think it was already that, but I just finally, it clicked for me at this point. So this piece particularly embodies like what it is to kind of succumb to depression or anxiety. Although like the gestures kind of seemingly uncomfortable, there's still a kind of like strange calm within the face, like almost as if she's just like chill with this. But then like it's like somehow like kind of wallowing in that own pain and sadness, and that's kind of what this work is about. It's like sometimes finding that help is even harder than just like, you know, just being in it. So here's a little bit more process for y'all. Shortly after I made that piece, I made another like smaller than life-size piece. This time with a lot more knowledge behind me and a lot more information. So this piece like went together a lot smoother than that first one. I would, as you can see, I'm making sure like everything looks great from the top view here. And then my studio, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the show Dexter, but my studio starts to feel a little bit like that after a while. Body parts wrapped in plastic everywhere, terrified screaming faces. It's a spooky place if you walk in the dark. But yeah, by making that piece, I learned quite a bit. So this is that piece finished. Again, it's painted with house paints, but you can see I'm making that attempt again to like incorporate casted glaze. That's what that little insert on her side is. It's kind of like this idea of a interruption in the harmony of the body. I think my color choice was a little off. It looks like planet Earth floating in her rib cage. But it was my first attempt at kind of like resolving these kind of issues. But this particular piece too is kind of like talking about that like uncomfortable feeling that you feel when you're being examined, like perhaps like at the doctor's office, like you're usually nude, you're usually very, very uncomfortable. I don't know about anybody else, but I freeze. So like it's kind of like this idea of like finding all the tension in the hands, fingers, and toes, and the eyes. So like at this point, like I was like, I figured out what I was doing and I was like, I'm going to take off with this. Like, we're just going to make all these figures that are, you know, based off of what I'm feeling right now. And it really did work out well for me. It was nice because I was able to be really honest about the work, and I'm able to talk about the work a lot better now because it's so personal and so close to me. And no one can tell me any different because it's my story. So that really allowed me to like flourish in the studio. So this piece, I made at a time where all of my friends were having children, and these were the children I was making. And so this piece, when I pulled it out of the kiln, I was like, oh, it's like my baby. So here's that piece finished, again, painted with house paints. This particular piece is titled Saudade, which is a Portuguese term that translates to a feeling of longing, melancholy, or nostalgia. Again, this piece was created at a time directly after like I was kind of coming out of a depression and finding help, was on medication for the first time, but it was still feeling like, will I ever be myself? Will I ever feel like myself again? Will I ever laugh again? Will I continue to just have these anxious feelings of doubt and failure? But again, like making this work has really helped me work through those feelings and ideas. I think this was the last piece that I made while I was at Studio 740. This is another one of the like of my all-time favorite pieces I've ever made. And it was also a redo of a former piece. You can see again my utilization of my block poster behind it. That's at the same scale as the piece. And basically using those armature pipes as ways to like kind of contort and turn and twist the body. So you can pull on those pipes and turn it. So she was able to like twist her body. So I was really able to like really play with how I was going to play with this gesture. That's what I really love about building solid, was the flexibility. And I was telling the class earlier about how a woman one time told me I joined clay with such frivolity, and I will never forget it. And that this is what allows me to do that, building solid. So here's that piece right before she went into the kiln. Again, shrink slabs to support the piece as it's firing. And as some of you clay, or as most of you clay people know, like when clay gets to a certain temperature, it starts to become a little wiggly inside there. I wish I had a camera to see it, but it'll warp, it'll change. And that's what these supports are there for, is to keep that from happening, or from things really changing too much beyond like that original idea I had in the first place. So this was the piece that I made a year prior, right? This was coil built. This was before I did any kind of solid building. Same ideas, but then this is the piece that when I redid it, I feel like it's a lot better. I don't know. I was a lot happier with it. So this particular piece, it's freestanding. She's about 36 inches tall. And there's a metal rod that goes up into the head. So it's a freestanding piece, 360 view all the way around. And this particular piece kind of addresses my own personal struggle with whether I desire to be a mother or not, or whether I can sustain my career if that is something I choose to do. This is, I know, an issue that a lot of other women deal with. And a lot of people think about whenever they're like struggling between like that time in their life where it's like a do or die situation. Everyone keeps reminding me how old I am. Like, I know I'm 37. All right. But again, like this piece was kind of like falling through space and kind of wondering where time was going. And she also kind of has this like pink, like motherly glow that I was going for as well. So shortly after I finished at Studio 740, I started my residency at the Archie Bray Foundation. I aimed to make a pretty large scale sculpture while I was there. And my original idea started with all of these hands all over the form. And I quickly did some editing and got rid of them because it started to look like something from a horror movie. But it was a really good lesson in remaining flexible in your ideas and remaining flexible in your own expectations of yourself. I had all these big ideas. I had finally gotten to the Bray, and I had this piece I wanted to make, and this was the only thing I made there. I didn't even finish it while I was there, so I felt really bummed. But a lot of it was because I spent almost 2 weeks making all of these hands and then scrapped them. Like, that's not work that wasn't, I feel like it was almost like some time wasted, but it wasn't. And, sometimes those things happen and not everything is precious. Oops. So here's that piece as I was finishing it. So you can see how much that clay shrinks in those top two pictures there. And then on the bottom is when I was finishing it whenever I got to the University of Oklahoma after I got my position there. So here's that piece finished. So the idea about this piece was to kind of, well, I guess it's pretty literal, like the titles respire. So the literal definition of that is to recover hope, courage, or strength after a time of difficulty. So I kind of wanted to kind of like create this piece that looked as if it was like kind of catching its breath and coming up from the depths of depression. And this piece was made shortly after I started my position at OU, and I was feeling, a little angry about like political situations and such. And so I made a lot of angry, screaming faces for about a year. So here's a little bit of a video for you, if it'll play. There we go. So this is a little bit of a glimpse on how I decorate my work. So I spray underglazes or paints, and I use the same method for either one, depending on what material I'm using. But it's just a gradation from, I'm basically using 3 colors in a monochrome palette and creating, skip in there, and then creating shadow and depth in that way. Lots of folks ask me like why I do that in addition to like the shadow and depth that's already there. And my answer is, I really want you to see the shadow and depth. So like, I'm really like just encouraging you to see what I want you to see, right? It's also another way for me to kind of like, you know, create illusions. There we go. So here's another quick process, little looped video here of another piece I created when I first started my position at OU. This particular piece was titled Covet. Again, I got a lot better at hollowing at this point. And hollowing things to about, this one's probably, I think, a little over, maybe about 1/4 inch thick. Here we go. Okay, so that's that piece finished. Again, decorated with underglazes, or sprayed with underglazes. And this piece was kind of about this idea, and I'm sure that like, I mean, many people have experienced this. I started thinking more about like these uncomfortable feelings we don't really want to talk about. So with this piece Covet, I was thinking about watching folks getting the awards and the exhibitions and the things that I wanted, and trying my hardest not to be jealous, but you kind of can't help it sometimes. Around that same time, starting my position at OU, I had a hard time finding balance in my life. And so I started creating work about it. So I started making these pieces that kind of balance on the edges of at the pedestal or of any kind of stand. So these pieces were kind of like teetering on the edge of, you know, losing control or finding their balance. Recently, I was told by a therapist, and this was the best advice I'd ever gotten, was that balance can never be obtained. It can only be maintained. I was like, oh my God, like mind blowing. In addition to that, those smaller studies, I of course had to make a giant foot. So this piece was about 3 feet tall, maybe a little taller to begin with. Again, hollowing it out, but I had a lot of issues with it, to be really honest. Oklahoma is very humid, and the clay rehydrates as you start to hollow it. And so I was up against new problems and struggled a lot with this piece. But in the end, I was somewhat happy with it. The color, I should have chosen a different color for sure, because I don't know how many times I've been told that it's a Hulk foot. So, and then again, creating more work about like kind of reaching for something more, always, you know, grass is always greener on the other side kind of idea, always trying to obtain something different. And then during the pandemic, my work kind of became small and changed a lot because I didn't have access to my large studio anymore. And I started making lots of tired eyes, and eyes became a big thing within my work. This piece I made last summer, again, during a very like anxious moment in my life. If you look closely, you can kind of see what looks like tears welling up in the eyes, and it's kind of like that idea, that burning feeling of those anxious tears kind of swelling to the surface and not being able to like contain them. And that was another portrait that I made last summer around the same time, titled Hope for the Hopeless. So while also making my sculptural work, I have another body of work. I always told myself that like, in order to keep that large sculptural work going, I had to have a bread and butter. I had to have a moneymaker. And I was sick of bartending. So I I needed something in my practice that was going to like fund the rest of the work. So I started making jewelry. I did this while I was at a residency at Red Lodge Clay Center in Red Lodge, Montana. That residency you have to pay for, and I was broke. And so I was like, well, we're going to make my money back while we're here. And so I made a bunch of jewelry. It initially started out as just mouths, eyes, hands, feet, you know, your PG parts. And then I was encouraged by another resident there to make a pair of penis earrings for her. And that led me down an insane path. And I was just like, every part has to be represented now. So that eventually led to Pottery, which has been super well received since I started doing it. I think this was, yeah, about 3 years ago, I started making this, this work. And this work actually kind of allows me to loosen up in my sculptural work now. It's really nice because these two things serve two different parts of my creative soul. Whereas like the figurative work is really physical and really challenging. This work allows me to do this all night and then like kind of like hide in my little studio and just kind of meditate on the work. It's allows me to be really meticulous about surface and particular about things. So I don't have to be that way anymore in my sculpture. So here's some more work along those lines. So this work is a lot about like self-acceptance, self-love, sexuality, things that I always felt very compelled to hide. But now at a certain point in my life, I'm like, why? That is also part of me. So by making this work, like it's been really eye-opening and encouraging. Like I've been encouraged by many, many people to continue making this work because it's unbelievable the kind of feedback I hear in regards of like women not feeling represented in the world. And this is something that really like sparks interest. And this is another jewelry form that I continue to make. It's called a self-love pendant. And here's another real quick video. The reason why I show this is because this is why I got shadow banned on Instagram for a while. This got reported and yeah, it wasn't good. For someone who makes part of their livelihood through that social media platform, it was really challenging that like someone decided that my art was too offensive and decided I shouldn't have it on the internet. And then these two pieces are part of a body of work I just finished last December. So I've ventured into making lamps now and more complex forms. And they've gotten a lot larger and a lot more detailed and complex. So moving on to what's in the exhibition at Light Art Space. I'm almost done, I promise. I had a really influential visit to the Dallas Museum of Art in March. I walked around that space. I don't know what was in the air that day, but it was just like inspiring all over. Looking at the way like hair was sculpted. And then this particular piece on this very tall pedestal here was the inspiration for the piece that's in the exhibition. I walked into this space and this pedestal was, I think, at least 10 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet tall, very tall, a lot taller than me. And it was really daunting when I walked in there. I felt like I was being judged by this head on this pedestal. So I was thinking about like, how do I feel about judgment? And that's always been something that's been really strong on my mind. But how do I feel about judgment? Like, who's judging me? Why are they judging me? Why am I judging others? And whose judgment holds weight? And so that led me down the path to finding the Roman god Janus, and talking about how that particular god was the god of beginnings, gates, transitions, time, duality, doorways, all of these things I'm kind of thinking about as I kind of come to term with my own identity. I also found the work at that museum of Donald DeLue. He's a sculptor that lived and worked in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Does a lot of monumental work. Like if you've been in Philly to the USPS like headquarters, he has like a large sculpture there. But I really love how ornate and kind of angular his work was, and how so many portions of the body were exaggerated. And you can't really see it in these three photos, but if you look at the breadth of his work, like the figures he sculpts are all very similar. They're very androgynous. And I was like, that's really interesting. I want to kind of follow down that path. So I started creating this piece that's in the show titled House of Judgment. So the idea was to have these kind of two heads that were both judging, but it was kind of this duality of like different types of judgment. So I like to say like one is more of like a snobby, like, you know, looking down upon you judgment, and the other one's kind of like, oh, bless your soul kind of judgment, like I feel sorry for you. And that's what I always feel like I experience in my life, whether or not I actually do. You know, I feel like I'm being judged for my actions, for my choices, for how I present to the world. So that was kind of me breaking down these kind of ideas and feelings. So you can see like the really teeny like maquette here next to the larger scale. So I always try to make smaller maquettes, especially if I'm going to make something that's this big. So I can start to kind of work through ideas before it gets too large and challenging and becomes like a whole different kind of animal to wrestle. And so you can see that piece as I'm working on it in the studio. All right, so here we are again. So here's some detail images of as I was working on the process of that after I'm getting the hair sculpted onto the piece. I was telling my class earlier today, I give my pieces my dream hair. I don't care. Like, I am the stylist of my own world. So that's how this works out. I know my hair is not that bountiful. All right, so here is that hollowing process. This was a bear of a piece to hollow. You can see like I just basically lopped off the top of the head and hollowed it out like it was a giant pot, right? But where the challenge came was when I had to start hollowing out the hair and reattaching the hair, and things started to kind of fall and become a little bit of a challenge. So you'll see these were like some of my resolutions to some of these challenges I was coming across, with like the hair starting to collapse in on itself or starting to fall off the head. So I had to create these supports and braces on the inside. So believe it or not, that's what the inside of that thing looks like. I wish that I could like put a little camera in there and like explore the caverns, you know? And here we are with those two sides finished, being sculpted. Baby in the kiln. When I load my kilns, specifically this piece, I had to take the entire kiln apart. So if you're familiar with scut kilns, you can take those rings off and slide that puppy in and then put them right back on. It is a lot of work, physical labor, but it really saves your back and it saves the piece while you're loading it. And then here we are. I actually, believe it or not, apply orange underglaze underneath my glaze that I chose for this particular piece because it really brings out the warmth in the glaze. And then here's a quick video of me glazing it while it was still in the kiln. So you can see all those rings are pulled off now. Unfortunately, our kiln room doesn't have air conditioning, and it's been like 100 degrees or hotter in Oklahoma almost every day. So it's been bonkers. But here's that piece finished alongside another piece that's also part of the exhibition. I haven't gotten like my real professional images yet. I'm gonna go do that this week. Brought my fancy camera. But I'm really excited about this work. Like, it's been really nerve-wracking making it because it's forcing me to be honest about my own personal identity, being queer and being gender fluid and being honest about that. It's especially kind of difficult to be honest about that, knowing that I'm like in a straight relationship. I know that's hard for people to grasp, and I know it's going to be really hard for my family to grasp. That's I'm like, oh, I told my mom not that long ago, and I think she gets it. She's like, as long as you're not leaving Matt, I'm okay. And I'm like, I'm not. I'm just telling you who I am in totality. But this work, like, it's really scary. Like, I feel like every few years I have this moment of like upheaval, and where I have to kind of like drag like the scary parts out of me through my work, and it's really freeing to be able to do that. And so here's you can tell I have a favorite side. Here's that piece finished. And I don't know if everybody's been able to get to the gallery yet to check it out, but please check it out. My husband did a wonderful job on building a 6-foot tall pedestal in one day. I love him. He works at the Art Museum on campus at the University of Oklahoma as a preparator. So I'm very lucky to have that resource. And then here's some real quick, like up close videos. So I doubt you can get this close. Well, yes, you can. You can get as close as you want. Just don't touch. But this was very like exciting and scary for me because again, like this is a whole new surface for me. I haven't put glaze on a sculpture and will ever, not since grad school. So I had many fears about this piece destroying itself or just turning out terrible. But I did all the testing. I did everything I was supposed to do, and it turned out almost exactly like I wanted it to. Oops. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with me for the last hour. If you would like to, you can follow me on Instagram. It's just at Jamie Bates Slone. Please give the University of Oklahoma a follow too. We're the U of OK Ceramics. And yeah, thanks everyone. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Any questions? Awesome.